My name is Layla. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as steady, dependable, quiet, the one who keeps things moving without needing to be seen. I work with systems, schedules, and people's trust. Nothing glamorous, nothing loud. If you passed me in the hallway, you probably wouldn't remember my face 5 minutes later. And that's usually been fine with me. People tend to underestimate me in a very specific way. Not because they think I'm incapable, but because they assume I won't push back, that I'll absorb confusion, smooth over mistakes, and carry discomfort privately so the room can stay calm. I'm often mistaken for someone who doesn't notice patterns, or who notices them and chooses not to care. The truth is quieter than that. I notice everything. I just don't react right away. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about a triumphant takedown or a dramatic confrontation. It's about what happens when silence stops being a reflex and becomes a decision. It's about patience, documentation, and the strange power of letting systems reveal the truth on their own. What you're about to hear is a first-person account of how my company used my login to approve overtime I never worked, and how, when I tried to understand what had happened, Payroll blamed me, logs blamed someone else. That sentence alone sounds like chaos, I know. But this isn't a story about chaos. It's a story about order slowly reasserting itself. Emotionally, this journey moves through confusion, self-doubt, and that specific kind of isolation that comes from being quietly accused without being openly confronted. There were moments where I questioned my own memory. Moments where staying silent felt easier than being precise. And then, gradually, moments where precision became the only thing that mattered. I'm sharing this not to dramatize workplace injustice and not to position myself as a hero. I made mistakes. I waited too long to ask certain questions. I assumed good faith longer than I should have. But I also learned something enduring. When systems are built on logs, permissions, and approvals, truth has a way of surfacing if you don't interrupt it with noise. As you listen, you won't hear shouting or villain speeches or miraculous twists of luck. You'll hear emails, timestamps, meetings that end a little too quickly, and the slow recalibration of how people look at you when facts refuse to bend. I promise honesty here. Not drama, not vengeance, just the quiet unfolding of events, exactly as they happened, and exactly as they felt from the inside. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, gently and without pressure. Have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do and felt that speaking louder wasn't going to save you? To them, I was reliable in the way furniture is reliable. Always there, always useful, rarely discussed. At work, my name came up most often in sentences that ended quickly. Layla will handle it. Layla already knows. Ask Layla, she's good with that. There was no malice in it, no praise either, just assumption. I was the person-shaped constant in a system full of variables. I worked in operations and payroll systems, access levels, approvals, time entries, reconciliations, the unglamorous backbone, the kind of work that only becomes visible when something breaks. When everything runs smoothly, people forget there's a human being maintaining the logic beneath it. That invisibility shaped how people spoke to me, not unkindly, casually, like I was always available, always calm, always fine. Meetings would happen around me, not with me. Decisions would be referenced after the fact, not discussed beforehand. I was looped in once the direction was set, not while it was forming. And I accepted that role because it fit the version of me they expected. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct people mid-sentence. When someone misunderstood my scope, I clarified privately, if at all. When credit drifted away from my work, I told myself accuracy mattered more than recognition. I believed competence would eventually speak for itself. There's a particular kind of trust people place in someone who never reacts emotionally. They start to believe you won't react at all, that you'll absorb discomfort the way systems absorb errors, quietly, invisibly, without complaint. Over time, I became the safe place where mistakes could land. If someone misfiled something, it was probably a system thing. If hours didn't reconcile, it was something Layla can check. If approvals looked odd, it was just how the tool works. I wasn't accused, I wasn't praised, I was assumed. That assumption came with a strange side effect. People stopped explaining things to me. They stopped checking context. They stopped asking permission before looping my name into processes I hadn't initiated. My login had elevated access, not because I asked for power, but because someone needed things to move quickly. And I let that stand because being useful felt safer than being visible. What they didn't see was how carefully I paid attention. I noticed who approved what without reading. I noticed when workflows changed without announcement. I noticed how often temporary access became permanent. I noticed that people trusted systems more than they trusted memory, and that most people never checked either. But to them, I was just the quiet one, the woman who stayed late without mentioning it, who answered emails without tone, who never escalated unless something was already on fire. I didn't correct the perception because at the time, it didn't feel wrong. It felt efficient. I told myself I preferred it this way. Less friction, less ego, less drama. Looking back, I can see how neatly that fit into a role others were comfortable assigning me. Competent enough to rely on, quiet enough to overlook. No one thought of me as someone who would challenge a narrative, or question an assumption once it was spoken out loud, or sit with uncertainty long enough to let the truth expose itself. They thought I was neutral, and neutrality, in a workplace, is often mistaken for compliance. I didn't mind being underestimated until the day that underestimation stopped being passive and became useful to someone else. Until my silence was no longer just my own habit, but something others relied on to keep questions from forming. At the time, though, I didn't know that yet. I only knew who I was to them. Reliable, quiet, replaceable, but inconvenient to replace. And most dangerously of all, someone they believed would never make things uncomfortable. The first sign that something was wrong didn't arrive as a crisis. It arrived as a line item. I was reviewing routine payroll reports one afternoon, the kind I had scanned hundreds of times before. Same filters, same date range, same quiet focus. My eyes moved automatically, catching anomalies before my conscious mind labeled them. That's when I saw the overtime. It wasn't dramatic. 2 entries, modest hours, approved under my login. At first, I assumed fatigue. I'd been working longer weeks, helping cover a transition after someone left. Memory can blur when days repeat themselves. I opened my calendar. No extra shifts, no special projects logged, no emails requesting after-hours support. Still, I didn't panic. I checked the timestamps. The approvals were logged late evening, times I was home, phone off, laptop closed. I remember that night clearly because I'd left work early for once. A small detail, but it stuck. My first instinct wasn't suspicion. It was self-correction. Maybe I forgot. Maybe I approved it earlier and the system synced later. Maybe someone asked verbally and I just absorbed it. That's how conditioned people think when they've spent years being the quiet constant. We look inward before we look outward. So I did what I always did. I double-checked. The system showed my user ID, my credentials. Clean approval flow. No error flags. I made a note in my black notebook, not as an accusation, just as a marker. Date, time, amount. I didn't tell anyone yet. There was no story to tell. Just a small discomfort, like a paper cut you only notice once you touch it. A few days later, it happened again. Different department, different employee, same pattern, overtime approved. My login, hours I never worked, never authorized, never discussed. That's when the cut stopped feeling accidental. I reached out to Payroll, not emotionally, not urgently, just a neutral question. Hey, I noticed some overtime approvals under my ID that I don't recognize. Can you help me understand the workflow on these? The response came back faster than expected. They thanked me for flagging it. Then, gently, they explained the system to me, as if I were new, as if I didn't help maintain it. They said approvals are logged under the approver's account. They said the system doesn't misattribute logins. They said if my ID approved it, then it must have been me. No accusation, just conclusion. I read the message twice, then a third time. Something in me tightened. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. This wasn't about overtime. It was about narrative. The system was being treated as infallible, and I was being treated as the system's extension. If the log said it was me, then it was me. No need for investigation. No need for curiosity. I didn't argue, not yet. I thanked them. I said I'd look into my records. I stayed polite because politeness had always kept things smooth. But that night, I didn't sleep well. Not because I was worried about money or blame, but because something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, my quiet reliability wasn't just invisible, it was being used. Someone had done something under my name, and the system, designed to protect accuracy, was now being used to protect assumption. I wrote more carefully in my notebook that evening, not feelings, facts. Because the smallest cuts are only harmless if you pretend they didn't happen. Once something happens twice, the mind looks for patterns. Once it happens 3 times, the body starts adjusting before the mind catches up. The overtime approvals continued, sporadic, quiet, almost polite in their modesty. Never large enough to trigger automatic alerts. Never frequent enough to look like theft at a glance. Just enough to feel plausible. And each time the explanation was the same. Payroll would reference the logs would reference my login, and the conversation would end there. No one said I was lying. No one said I was careless. They didn't need to. The structure of the response implied it. A closed loop of logic that left no room for nuance. I noticed how quickly the language shifted from, "That's strange," to "That's how the system works." Curiosity faded. Assumption settled in. After a while, people stopped responding with explanations at all. They responded with reminders. Just be mindful of approvals. Make sure you're logging out. Let us know if you need refresher access training. Each message was calm, professional, reasonable on the surface, and each one moved the responsibility further onto me. This is how disrespect becomes normalized, not through overt hostility, but through repetition. Through small corrections you didn't earn. Through suggestions you didn't request. Through the quiet repositioning of you from reliable to potentially sloppy without anyone ever saying it out loud. I started noticing subtle changes. A manager CC'd my supervisor when asking about approvals, something that had never happened before. Another asked me to confirm actions I hadn't taken, as if confirmation itself were an admission. Meetings included brief references to tightening controls, always framed as procedural, never personal. But I felt it. The air around my name had shifted. I considered pushing back. I drafted messages I never sent. Clear, factual, firm. But every time I imagined the response, the logs show your ID. End of discussion. So I did what people like me are trained to do. I rationalized. It's probably temporary. They're just covering themselves. This will resolve once the quarter ends. I told myself that staying calm was strategic, that not escalating was maturity, that drawing attention to myself would only complicate things. In reality, I was still operating under an old rule, that good faith would eventually be reciprocated. What I didn't realize yet was that good faith, once taken for granted, is rarely returned. It's consumed, reused, redirected, and my silence was making something else possible. By not objecting publicly, I was allowing the story to harden. Each unchallenged instance made the next one easier. Not just for whoever was using my login, but for everyone watching the system prove its own version of events. I began to feel a quiet isolation that's hard to describe. Not exclusion, not hostility, just a subtle distancing. Conversations that ended a beat too early. Emails that felt more formal than before. No one asked me how I was doing. They didn't need to. From their perspective, nothing unusual was happening. A process issue, a training gap, something manageable. From mine, something was being rehearsed. A version of me who made mistakes. A version of me who forgot. A version of me who needed reminders. And the longer I let that version stand, the more believable it became. That's the danger of normalized disrespect. It doesn't announce itself. It just waits for you to get used to it. I wasn't angry yet, but I was awake. It became clear to me one morning, not through an incident, but through a tone. A manager I rarely worked with sent an email about a routine approval delay. My name was included in the thread, not as the cause, but as the explanation. Layla usually handles this, they wrote. She'll fix it. No question mark, no request, just expectation. That sentence sat with me longer than it should have. Not because it was unfair, I did usually handle it, but because of what it revealed. I wasn't being seen as a person making decisions. I was being seen as a function. And functions don't get the benefit of doubt. They get adjusted. As the overtime issue lingered unresolved, that functional role hardened into something else. I was now the person who would quietly absorb discrepancies so the process could keep moving. The buffer. the soft edge where errors could land without making noise. No one asked who else had access to my credentials. No one asked whether approvals could be proxied. No one asked whether logs showed where the action came from, only whose name it was under. Those questions would have required effort. They would have slowed things down. And I was the person whose presence allowed things to stay fast. I started to see the outline of the role I'd been assigned. Reliable, useful, invisible, responsible but not authoritative, trusted but not defended. It wasn't personal. That's what made it dangerous. Roles like this don't require intent. They emerge naturally in systems where someone is competent, quiet, and consistently accommodating. Over time, people stop checking in with you and start checking around you. I noticed that when issues came up, the room would turn slightly toward me, not for answers, but for resolution. Not what happened, but how can this be smoothed over? And because I'd spent years being that smoother, no one considered that I might refuse the role. Even I hadn't considered it. I kept doing my job, thoroughly, calmly. I answered questions, I documented processes, I stayed late when needed. Outwardly, nothing changed. Internally, something had crystallized. I realized that if I spoke up emotionally, I'd be framed as defensive. If I spoke up casually, I'd be dismissed. And if I spoke up precisely, too precisely, I'd disrupt a balance others had grown comfortable with. So I stopped trying to explain. Instead, I started observing the role as if it belonged to someone else, watching how often my name was used as a placeholder for responsibility, how rarely it was used as a source of authority. That distance gave me clarity. This wasn't about overtime anymore. It was about how narratives form around the quietest person in the room, and how easily that person becomes the default answer when no one wants to look deeper. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't correct the emails. I didn't ask for meetings. I just stopped volunteering to absorb confusion. And in that pause, something subtle began to shift. Not externally, not yet. But internally, the role I had been assigned no longer felt inevitable. It felt chosen, maintained by habit, and therefore changeable. I didn't know what I was going to do with that realization. I only knew I wasn't going to rush it. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't come with a raised voice or a sharp email. It happened alone, after hours, in a nearly empty office. I had stayed late, not to fix anything urgent, but because I needed quiet. The building felt different at night. No interruptions, no performative productivity, just systems running the way they were designed to run, without commentary. I logged into the Payroll platform again, slowly, intentionally, not with the mindset of someone defending themselves, but with the curiosity of someone studying a structure from the inside. For the first time, I stopped asking why this happened to me and started asking how this could happen at all. That change in framing mattered. I reviewed access hierarchies, not just mine, but adjacent roles, temporary permissions, legacy credentials, emergency overrides that had never been rolled back because no one wanted to disrupt workflows. I noticed how often temporary meant until someone remembers. I noticed how audit logs summarized actions without context. I noticed which fields were visible to payroll and which were not. And then I noticed something else. Approvals under my login didn't always originate from my workstation. The system logged my user ID, but not my device fingerprint in the reports payroll used. That data existed, but it lived one layer deeper, in a section most people never opened because it required effort and familiarity. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't screenshot. I didn't email myself proof. I sat there and breathed. Because for the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting. I was understanding. The realization wasn't explosive. It was steady, almost relieving. The kind of clarity that doesn't raise your heart rate. It slows it down. This wasn't a personal failure. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't sloppiness. It was a system being used exactly as designed by someone who understood where accountability stopped. And suddenly, my silence made sense. Not as weakness, but as positioning. By not disrupting the process early, I had allowed patterns to repeat. By not escalating emotionally, I had let the data accumulate. I closed my laptop and wrote one sentence in my notebook. Let it continue. Not out of spite, out of precision. That was the moment something inside me settled. I stopped feeling defensive. I stopped feeling misunderstood. I stopped needing anyone to believe me yet. I didn't need belief. I needed completeness. From that night on, silence wasn't something happening to me. It was something I was choosing. Once silence became intentional, everything around me changed, without anyone else noticing. I stopped offering explanations that hadn't been asked for. I stopped softening my language to preempt discomfort. I responded only to what was written, not to what was implied. If someone said, "Your login approved this," I replied, "Noted. Please proceed per policy." No defense, no emotion, no contradiction. It was remarkable how quickly people filled that silence with their own assumptions. They assumed I had accepted responsibility. They assumed I was being careful now. They assumed the issue was resolving itself. In reality, nothing had changed operationally. The overtime approvals continued. The logs continued to point to me, and each instance added another clean, timestamp layer to the record. I kept doing my job well, meticulously, visibly, without deviation. I logged my actual work hours precisely. I made sure my calendar was accurate down to the quarter hour. I changed nothing about my behavior that could later be questioned. That consistency was important. Silence without discipline looks like avoidance. Silence with discipline looks like confidence. People mistook it for indifference. A colleague joked one afternoon, "At least you're not stressed about it." I smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it confirmed something I needed to know. They couldn't imagine that my calm had structure behind it. I noticed how often people talk themselves into comfort when the person affected doesn't protest. How quickly concern evaporates when the room stays quiet. How systems are trusted more when no one interrupts their story. And I noticed something else. The person, or people, using my login grew bolder. Approvals became slightly more frequent, still careful, still measured, but less hesitant. That told me everything. Whoever it was believed the risk had passed, that the narrative had settled, that I was the kind of person who would quietly carry this forever rather than disturb the equilibrium. They didn't know that my silence was no longer passive. It was procedural. I wasn't waiting for the right emotional moment. I was waiting for the record to become undeniable, for the system to tell a story so complete that it wouldn't need my voice at all. That kind of patience changes how you move through a room. I stopped scanning faces for validation. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I let meetings happen without me performing reassurance. And something subtle occurred. People began underestimating me even more. They spoke freely around me. They referenced processes casually. They assumed I wasn't paying attention. That assumption was the last thing they got wrong. While everything on the surface stayed calm, something else was happening underneath. I was preparing, not in a dramatic way, and not all at once. Quietly, methodically, in the margins of my normal days. What they never noticed was how much time I spent learning the parts of the system no one else bothered with. The sections buried behind extra authentication steps. The logs that weren't included in standard reports because they were considered too technical for everyday use. I learned where data aged out. I learned how long raw access logs were retained before being summarized. I learned which reports were considered authoritative in disputes, and which ones were quietly dismissed as supporting only. I also learned people who rushed approvals, who avoided documentation, who hated meetings, and would agree to almost anything to end one early. I didn't ask questions that would raise flags. I asked the kinds of questions that sounded like process improvement, compliance alignment, risk reduction, things organizations like to hear, even if they don't always act on them. And I wrote everything down, not screenshots, not files I shouldn't have, just dates, times, system behaviors, and references to where information lived. Enough that I could reproduce the trail later without ever needing to say, "Trust me." At the same time, I positioned myself carefully. I volunteered for a routine audit support task, nothing prestigious, just helpful. That role gave me legitimate reasons to access deeper logs without raising suspicion. It also put my name in a different context, not just operations, but compliance adjacent. That mattered, because when questions eventually surfaced, the credibility of who asked them would be just as important as the questions themselves. Meanwhile, the overtime approvals continued to stack up, each one neatly logged, each one clean, each one wrong. I let them accumulate past what could be explained away as error, past coincidence, past training gaps. There's a threshold where patterns stop being deniable. I was aiming for that threshold. What no one noticed was that my demeanor hadn't changed because I was disengaged. It had changed because I was no longer improvising. I was following a plan, one built not on confrontation but on inevitability. Systems don't respond to emotion, they respond to evidence. And I was letting the system speak. The reveal didn't feel like victory. It felt like confirmation. I was alone when I finally pulled the full sequence together. Not just approvals, but origins, device identifiers, session overlaps, the quiet inconsistencies that only appear when you stop looking at summaries and start looking at timelines. The pattern was clear. My login had been used from a workstation I had never touched during windows when I was demonstrably elsewhere. The system had recorded it all. It just hadn't surfaced that layer by default. What struck me most wasn't who it pointed to, but how obvious it was once you knew where to look. This wasn't a hack. It wasn't a glitch. It was convenience masquerading as efficiency. Someone with access had learned they could approve overtime quickly by using credentials already trusted by the system. No alerts, no friction. And because I was quiet, because I didn't escalate early, it had worked. I didn't print anything. I didn't send copies to myself. I didn't confront anyone privately. I sat with the knowledge. There's a moment in situations like this where people rush. They want release. They want validation. They want someone to finally say, you were right. I didn't, because I understood something then that I hadn't before. The moment you reveal leverage, you lose control of how it's interpreted. I wasn't ready to be interpreted. Instead, I mapped the path forward, not emotionally, procedurally. What questions would trigger a deeper audit? Which departments would be required to participate? What documentation would be considered neutral rather than accusatory? I realized I didn't need to accuse anyone. I just needed to ask the right question, in the right forum, at the right time. And suddenly, the anxiety that had followed me for weeks disappeared. In its place was something steadier. Clarity. I closed my notebook that night with no sense of urgency, no adrenaline, just resolve. Because the story was no longer about me being blamed. It was about the system being forced to finish its sentence. Once you know the truth, you still have to decide what to do with it. That was the hardest part. Not the discovery, not the waiting, but the choice. Because there were several paths open to me, and each one led to a different version of the future. I could have gone to my manager privately, shown them the logs, let them handle it quietly. That would have protected relationships. It would have kept things contained. It also would have allowed the narrative to be reshaped behind closed doors. I could have gone straight to HR, filed a formal complaint, forced an investigation immediately. That would have been clean and procedural, but also isolating. Complaints have a way of following the person who files them, no matter how justified. Or I could have confronted the person I suspected, asked them why, given them a chance to explain. That option tempted the part of me that still wanted fairness to feel mutual, but each of those options shared a flaw. They relied on someone else to carry the truth forward without dilution. I wasn't willing to risk that, so I chose the irreversible path, the one that didn't require anyone to believe me at the outset. I decided to let the system initiate the reckoning. The company had a scheduled internal audit coming up. Routine, predictable, usually uneventful. I had supported these audits before, quietly providing data when asked. This time, I prepared differently. I didn't submit accusations, I didn't flag anomalies. I submitted a request for expanded log correlation, framed as a compliance improvement, a best practice. Something auditors appreciate because it suggests maturity, not trouble. It was approved without question. That approval locked the process in place. Once auditors request correlated logs across systems, the scope can't easily be reduced without explanation. And once device-level data enters the review, narratives based on usernames alone start to unravel. I remember the moment I clicked submit. Not relief, not fear. Finality. From that point on, nothing could be quietly adjusted. Nothing could be smoothed over with a conversation. The system would either confirm the official story or contradict it in writing. I didn't tell anyone what I'd done. I went back to work, answered emails, attended meetings, stayed calm, and waited. From the outside, my days looked unchanged. That was the point. I arrived at the same time each morning. I drank the same coffee. I answered emails in the same measured tone. I sat in the same meetings, nodded at the same checkpoints, and closed my laptop at the same hour. If anyone had been watching closely, which they weren't, they would have seen continuity, not tension. But silence, when it's chosen, has a different texture. It isn't empty, it's structured. The audit request I submitted moved through internal systems the way routine things do, without ceremony. No one announced it. No one flagged it as sensitive. It didn't need approval from leadership, just sign off from compliance. And compliance loves anything that sounds preventative. Expanded log correlation looks like responsibility, not resistance. That phrase mattered. Language always does. Once approved, the request triggered a sequence I was familiar with, but had never been on the initiating side of before. IT security received a task to extract raw authentication data. Payroll systems were asked to provide approval histories beyond summary views. Badge access logs were queued, not because anyone suspected wrongdoing, but because correlation requires context. No accusations, no names, no narrative, just data requested by policy. I wasn't looped into those exchanges. That was intentional too. The less visible my involvement, the less anyone could frame the process as personal. I wanted the audit to feel like something that had simply happened, a natural consequence of existing controls. At the same time, I became unusually precise. I documented my own actions with almost ritual consistency. Login times, logout times, locations. Not because I feared being questioned, but because precision sharpens patience. It keeps you grounded in what you know, rather than what you imagine others are thinking. I also became careful about what I didn't say. When colleagues referenced the overtime issue casually, that weird thing from last month, I didn't correct them. When someone joked about systems being temperamental, I smiled politely. When payroll sent a reminder about best practices, I thanked them and followed it exactly as written. Compliance is powerful when it's boring. The audit process began to ripple outward in subtle ways. At first, it showed up as delays. Still waiting on security logs. Payroll data extraction is taking longer than expected. Then it showed up as questions that weren't directed at me, but were about me. Does Layla ever work remotely? Is her schedule flexible? Which teams does she usually approve overtime for? None of these questions reached me directly. I heard them secondhand, relayed casually without concern. That distance told me something important. The process was no longer trying to confirm my memory. It was trying to reconcile timelines. And timelines don't lie politely. I noticed how people's behavior shifted once the audit crossed an invisible line, from theoretical to operational. Meetings ended faster. Conversations became more careful. People who used to speak in generalities started referencing policies. It wasn't panic yet, it was awareness. I stayed neutral, not detached, neutral. There's a discipline to neutrality when you know more than others. It requires resisting the urge to signal, to hint, to prepare the ground socially. I did none of that, because signaling invites negotiation, and negotiation invites compromise. I wanted neither. I also paid attention to something else. Who became quiet? Not everyone reacts to uncertainty the same way. Some people over-explain. Some become performatively helpful. Others withdraw. The person I suspected most did not withdraw. They continued as normal, approved things quickly, spoke confidently, joked in meetings. If anything, they seemed relieved, like the danger had passed. That told me they didn't know how deep the audit went. Most people don't. They think of audits as surface checks, summaries, spot reviews. They don't realize how much context is preserved when someone decides to look underneath. Weeks passed. The overtime approval stopped. Not gradually, abruptly. No announcement, no explanation, just a clean break. That alone would have been enough to make a casual observer uneasy. But no one mentioned it. Silence has a way of absorbing changes that benefit the group. I noted the date. Stopping doesn't erase history. It just adds a final data point. One afternoon, my manager asked if I had time for a quick check-in. The tone was friendly. The topic ostensibly was workload planning for the next quarter. We talked about capacity, about upcoming projects, about how things had been a bit noisy lately. I listened more than I spoke. At one point, they said, "You've handled all of this very professionally." I thanked them. That was all. What they meant, I realized, was, "You didn't make this harder." They didn't yet know that I had made it unavoidable. As the audit continued, I became something of a fixed point. People came to me for procedural clarity, not emotional reassurance. That was a shift. Subtle, but meaningful. When someone asked, "How does the system usually log approvals?" I explained the documented behavior, not the hidden layers. When someone asked, "Is it possible for credentials to be reused?" I referenced policy, not practice. I never lied. I never volunteered. That balance kept me credible without making me visible. Near the end of the audit window, IT security sent out a notice about enhanced authentication hygiene. It was phrased as a general reminder. But reminders don't appear in isolation. Something had surfaced. I didn't celebrate. I didn't relax. I stayed exactly where I was. Because silence only works if you don't break it too early. I knew the next phase wouldn't be quiet. Not truly. But the noise wouldn't start with me. It would start with a document. The first consequence wasn't confrontation. It was subtraction. Processes that used to glide suddenly slowed. Approvals that once happened in minutes now required double checks. Access that had been assumed was quietly restricted. No announcements, no explanations, just friction where there hadn't been any before. Friction is how organizations signal concern without admitting it. I noticed it in small things. A ticket that bounced back instead of being auto-approved. A request for justification where none had been needed before. A calendar invite that included one extra person, compliance this time. People started feeling the loss of ease before they understood the cause. Conversation shifted. What changed? Did policy update? Why does this suddenly need sign-off? No one said my name. They didn't have to. The system itself was speaking now, and it was no longer comfortable. The person I suspected began asking questions. Careful ones. Hypothetical ones. Out of curiosity, they said once, too casually. How deep do audits usually go? I answered truthfully. As deep as the request requires. Nothing more. Meetings grew tense in that quiet way where no one wants to be the first to acknowledge uncertainty. People spoke slower. Notes were taken more seriously. Jokes stopped landing. Then came the emails. Not about overtime, not directly. About process adherence. About credential integrity. About segregation of duties. Language tightened. I watched how quickly people repositioned themselves when consequences began to crystallize. Some grew helpful. Some grew defensive. Some disappeared from threads altogether. What struck me most was how little anyone asked me. Not because they didn't think I mattered, but because the narrative had moved past personality. This was no longer about whether I was mistaken or forgetful. It was about whether the system had been misused. And systems don't have feelings to manage. The audit findings weren't shared broadly at first. They never are. But their existence changed behavior immediately. You could feel it in the way people checked before speaking, in the way meetings ended with, "Let's follow up in writing." Documentation suddenly mattered. One afternoon, Payroll reached out. Not with blame, but with caution. "We're reviewing historical approvals," they wrote. "We may need clarification on a few items." I replied simply, "Happy to assist. Let me know what you need." For the first time, the tone was different. No reminders, no assumptions, just process. That's when I knew the shift was irreversible. Because once consequences begin, not loud ones, but structural ones, there's no going back to comfort. Only forward into accountability. And accountability doesn't care who stayed quiet. Panic doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like efficiency turned frantic. The first sign that it was too late came disguised as problem solving. Meetings were scheduled with vague titles. Process alignment, workflow review, access hygiene sync. People who had never cared about these topics suddenly had opinions. Strong ones. Everyone wanted to fix something. What no one could agree on was what exactly needed fixing. Because by the time panic arrives, the original problem is already documented. What people are reacting to isn't the issue itself. It's the realization that the issue is no longer controllable. I could feel it in the sudden urgency around policy language. Entire email threads were devoted to phrasing. Not solutions, phrasing. Should we say misuse or misconfiguration? Is this a training gap or a process gap? Do we need to involve legal at this stage? These weren't questions asked to understand. They were questions asked to contain. Containment is the instinct of organizations when accountability threatens to exceed hierarchy. I stayed where I had always been, on the edge of these conversations, present but not central. People didn't know whether to loop me in or keep me out, and that hesitation told me everything. If they included me, they risked legitimizing my perspective. If they excluded me, they risked looking evasive. So they hesitated. Meanwhile, the audit findings moved forward without drama. Drafted, reviewed, cross-checked. Once written, documents like that don't bend easily. They don't care about intention. They don't care about tone. They care about sequence. And the sequence was unforgiving. approvals under my login, originating from another device, repeated over time, without corresponding work records. No amount of reframing could undo that. I watched people try anyway. There were suggestions to reset credentials across the board, as if that would blur the past. Proposals for shared accountability, as if diffusion could soften clarity. Even a brief, uncomfortable attempt to recenter the conversation on my communication style. That one didn't last long, because once evidence exists, personality stops mattering. That's when the calls began. Private, careful calls, not confrontations, feelers. Just checking in. Wanted to make sure you're okay. Let me know if you need support. Support for what exactly was never specified. I responded kindly, briefly. Honestly, I was fine. What they were really asking was something else. Are you going to make this harder? They still thought there was room to maneuver. There wasn't. The person who had used my login tried something late in the process, a subtle repositioning. They referenced workload pressure, time constraints, the culture of just get it done. None of that contradicted the findings. In fact, it reinforced them. Because systems don't evaluate motivation, they evaluate action. By the time leadership was briefed, the narrative had already been written, by timestamps, by access logs, by the simple math of presence and absence. No one asked me to justify myself. That was the quietest confirmation of all. The panic peaked not with anger, but with regret. Regret that someone had assumed I wouldn't notice. Regret that silence had been mistaken for ignorance. Regret that convenience had been chosen over caution. And still, no one raised their voice, because it was too late to fix anything loudly. The only options left were administrative, procedural, final. I felt something unexpected then, not triumph, not vindication, relief. Not because anyone had apologized yet, not because consequences had landed, but because the weight of being quietly miscast had lifted. The story no longer belonged to the people trying to manage it. It belonged to the record, and records don't negotiate. The confrontation, when it finally came, did not look like confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no slammed door, no dramatic reveal. It arrived as a calendar invite. Subject, clarification meeting, duration, 30 minutes, attendees, my manager, someone from HR, someone from compliance, and me, no one else. That detail mattered. When I walked into the room, everything felt deliberately neutral. The blinds were half open, the lights were soft. Everyone had a notebook, not a laptop. That alone told me this wasn't exploratory anymore. This was procedural. They weren't looking for information. They were preparing to acknowledge it. We exchanged polite greetings, the kind that signal professionalism, not warmth. No one asked how I was doing. No one needed to. This wasn't about my emotional state. It started with compliance. They spoke slowly, clearly, reading from prepared notes. They summarized the audit findings without adjectives, without interpretation. Just sequence, dates, systems, discrepancies. When they finished, the room was quiet, not tense, complete. Then my manager spoke, carefully, not defensively. They said, based on this review, it's clear that actions were taken under your credentials that you did not perform. They paused. I nodded. That was all. No relief, no visible reaction, just acknowledgement. HR asked if I had anything to add. This was the moment people imagine when they think of vindication. The moment to speak, to reclaim the narrative, to explain how it felt to be doubted. I didn't. I said, the findings reflect what I observed. I don't have anything further to add. That sentence did more than any speech could have. It positioned me not as someone seeking justice, but as someone aligned with process. Calm. Finished. HR nodded. Compliance made a note. Then came the question they had clearly rehearsed. Is there anything you need from the company at this time? I took a breath. Not because I was emotional, but because precision matters most when the room is quiet. Yes, I said. I'd like written confirmation that I'm not considered responsible for the approvals in question, and that my record reflects that. No accusation, no demands, just documentation. They agreed immediately. That speed told me everything. There was no resistance because there was nothing left to defend. The meeting ended exactly on time. As we stood up, my manager lingered for a moment. The others stepped out, giving us space without making it obvious. They looked at me, not with guilt, not with authority, but with something closer to recalibration. I'm sorry, they said. I should have asked more questions earlier. I believed them, but apologies, I had learned, are less important than structural change. Thank you, I replied. I understand. And I did. Not in a forgiving way. In an accurate one. We didn't hug. We didn't linger. We didn't rehash. That restraint mattered. In the days that followed, consequences unfolded quietly. Access controls were revised, credential sharing policies were reissued, this time with enforcement. The person responsible was reassigned, pending further review. No announcement was made. No one needed one. People noticed anyway. They noticed because I was treated differently. Not elevated, not spotlighted, just consulted. My name was no longer used as shorthand for resolution. It was used with intent. Questions came before decisions now, not after. When I spoke, people listened. Not because I was louder, but because the system had confirmed my reliability in the only language organizations truly respect. Records. The person who had used my login never confronted me directly. They avoided me at first. Then later, they nodded politely in passing. Nothing more. That was enough. I didn't need acknowledgement from them. Their discomfort was not my responsibility. What mattered was this. The narrative had inverted without noise. I had not argued. I had not defended myself emotionally. I had not demanded to be believed. I had simply allowed the truth to finish assembling itself. That's what quiet dominance looks like. Not control over others, but control over timing, over framing, over when to speak and when not to. By the time the confrontation happened, there was nothing left to fight, only conclusions to accept, and I accepted them calmly. After everything settled, people expected me to change. They watched for it, a sharper edge, a colder tone, some visible marker that I had been through something and come out altered. What surprised them, and at first surprised me, was that I hadn't become harder. I had become clearer. The version of me that emerged after the audit wasn't louder or more assertive in the obvious ways. I didn't start dominating meetings. I didn't interrupt. I didn't suddenly seek recognition. That would have been a misunderstanding of what had actually happened. What changed was internal alignment. Before I had been competent but diffused, spread thin across other people's assumptions, absorbing responsibility without authority. Now, my sense of self sat squarely inside my own boundaries. I knew exactly where my responsibility began and where it ended. That knowledge altered everything. I stopped preemptively fixing problems that weren't mine. I stopped translating ambiguity for people who hadn't bothered to be precise. I stopped cushioning discomfort that belonged to systems, not individuals. Not out of bitterness, out of respect for myself and for the work. When someone asked me to just take a look at something outside my scope, I asked a clarifying question instead of jumping in. When timelines were unrealistic, I said so calmly, without apology. When a decision affected my domain, I expected to be included before it was finalized. None of this was confrontational. It was factual. And facts, I had learned, are harder to argue with than emotion. What also changed was how I related to silence. Before, silence had been a habit, something I defaulted to in order to keep peace. Now, silence was a tool I used deliberately. I spoke when it added value. I stayed quiet when the system could speak better than I could. That discernment gave me a strange kind of presence. People noticed when I spoke, because I no longer filled space unnecessarily. My words landed with weight, not volume. I also noticed a shift in how I saw others. I became less reactive to incompetence and more attentive to incentives. I stopped assuming malice where convenience explained behavior better. At the same time, I stopped excusing patterns just because they were familiar. I could see systems now, not just technical ones, but human ones, who benefited from ambiguity, who thrived in shortcuts, who relied on someone else staying quiet. And instead of resenting that, I adjusted how close I stood to it. The most profound change, though, was private. I no longer needed to be believed immediately. That sounds small, but it's not. There's a particular anxiety that comes from needing others to validate your reality in real time. From feeling that if you don't explain yourself now, you'll lose the chance forever. That anxiety was gone. I trusted my own perception. I trusted my patience. I trusted that truth, if handled correctly, doesn't require urgency. That trust made me calmer in ways people couldn't quite name. A colleague once said, "You seem grounded lately." I smiled at that. Grounded was exactly the word. Not elevated, not victorious, just anchored. I didn't think about the person who had used my login very often. When I did, it wasn't with anger. It was with a kind of clinical understanding. They had mistaken my quiet for cover. They had assumed that systems exist to serve speed, not accountability. They were wrong, but I didn't need them to know how wrong they were. The consequences had already rearranged their world in ways I didn't need to witness. What mattered was what I carried forward. I became more intentional about mentorship, especially with people who reminded me of my former self. The quiet ones, the competent ones, the ones who solve problems so efficiently that no one notices they're doing it. I didn't warn them dramatically. I didn't scare them. I asked better questions. Who else sees this? Is that documented? Where does accountability live here? I watched their posture shift when they realized those questions were allowed. And slowly, I began to see my experience not as something that had happened to me, but as something that had refined me. I hadn't lost my calm. I hadn't lost my empathy. I hadn't lost my preference for low drama. I had lost only one thing: the belief that silence automatically equals safety. Now silence had to earn its place. I still work with systems. I still prefer clarity to confrontation. I still don't raise my voice. But I no longer disappear into reliability. I stand inside it. And that, quietly, steadily, has made all the difference. When I look back on everything now, the story doesn't feel dramatic to me. It feels instructional, not in the sense of a lesson delivered from a podium, but in the way experience rearranges what you pay attention to. Before this happened, I believed that being calm, capable, and agreeable would naturally protect me. That if I stayed reasonable, systems would remain fair. That if something went wrong, the truth would surface quickly because it always does. What I learned instead is quieter and more precise. Systems don't protect people, they protect patterns. If a pattern is convenient, it will be preserved, sometimes long after it stops being just. And if a person fits neatly into that pattern, they can be used by it without anyone consciously deciding to do harm. No villain, no conspiracy, just momentum. The hardest part of this experience wasn't being blamed. It was realizing how easily silence can be mistaken for consent, by others and eventually by yourself. How quickly keeping things smooth can turn into carrying weight that was never yours to begin with. I don't regret staying calm. I don't regret not escalating emotionally. Those instincts served me, but only once I paired them with intention. Calm without awareness is absorption. Calm with structure is power. That's the distinction that changed everything. There was no moment where I felt triumphant, no sense of having won. What I felt instead was relief that the truth no longer required my energy to sustain it. Once it was documented, it didn't need defending. It could stand on its own, and so could I. If there's a moral here, it isn't speak up louder or trust no one. It's this: pay attention to where responsibility flows when no one is watching. Notice who benefits from your quiet, and understand that patience is not passivity when it's paired with clarity. You don't have to become confrontational to stop being invisible. You don't have to trade your calm for credibility. But you do have to choose when silence serves you and when it serves someone else. I'm sharing this story not because it's exceptional, but because it's common. Variations of it play out every day in offices, teams, and systems that reward speed over reflection. If you've ever been the reliable one, the quiet one, the person who handles it while others move on, I see you. And I'm curious, when you listen to this story, what part felt most familiar to you?